They're talking about blockchain.
To find the next coin. And it takes time, even for a very fast computer, to find a coin, which they call mining. So I'm probably not explaining it very well. Joe, go ahead.
Well, I mean, yes, so that is, that they get very, very, very complex. And so, I mean, because there are all different types of, and Mike Taylor will probably be able to explain it in many ways better than us, but it's mathematics. The whole thing is mathematics underneath. There's something called a hash function, and it turns everything into a digital fingerprint that nobody can reverse. And so then they have two matched numbers and one secret one. Oh. Okay, and that's how they essentially that turns into what is a digital signature. And so from there, they have things like they get really complex with the idea of markup chains and everything.
The whole benefit, as I understand, is so that you can have peer-to-peer transactions. Yeah. You don't need to go through a bank or an advisor or whatever. It's simply you have this transaction that's accounted for mathematically, and you can do direct transaction with you as the purchaser and or customer, and the other person is the merchant, and so there you go, peer-to-peer transactions.
And peer-to-peer is actually, I actually had done some work with that, and what you mentioned, even the amount of tremendous energy that is taken up with a blockchain and maintaining that. That was one of the things that wasn't really widely available back when I was even doing something with peer-to-peer for a very brief period, 12 years ago, 14 years ago. And I only looked at it through a very, very narrow way. But obviously this would change everything. If you were able to ensure the transactions, and even think about this from perspective. I remember reading extensively how
where's Benjamin?
This would instill a certain amount of trust in governments too, and certain governments that weren't trustworthy opposed it. So one example would be property records. That I remember The Economist went through a whole story about how a woman lost her house and essentially they bulldozed it. It sounded just like what went on in Connecticut here in the United States with the Kelo decision, with the eminent domain, but nonetheless, but it essentially they took her house, they bulldozed it, and there was really no property records that actually could be validated. And with a blockchain, that would instill the type of confidence that would be in the transactions that currently didn't exist. So therefore, you would have people that aren't trustworthy would obviously oppose that.
But instead of actually having fiat money, as they call it, or actually having either coin or paper money to access your account, you have a sophisticated mathematical password to get to your particular, the Bitcoins or the crypto that you own.
Right.
And it's very important that you don't lose that, because if you do, then you lose access. You can't physically go get it. It's kind of like, well, you have the same thing, I guess, with a bank. You have an account number and a password to get in. But with Bitcoin or with crypto, it's a very sophisticated, it's probably one that you can't remember. So you need to write it down or keep it someplace safe, because if someone has access then to your password to get into your Bitcoin, then they could steal it from you. And so, but go ahead.
It's a digital signature.
It's a digital signature.
And that's the digital signature that can't be accessed outside of, essentially you.
Except because it's so complicated, and early on people would forget it, they'd lose money because they came up with something called a crypto wallet.
Right.
The crypto wallet doesn't have the same protection has that mathematical signature itself. So that created a whole new round of problems. You need to protect that wallet. So anyway, go ahead, Joe. With where
No, I mean,
go with Tom?
no, oh yeah. And coming back to John, is that basically he had that he had a company called DigiCash, and that company was just something that was just beyond prior to its time. So it's an example of like essentially how how all these other ideas, then it's the genesis for all these other ideas. So that's really where he pioneered the idea that money could be private. And so this is I would say one of the early pioneers of digital cash. So that's where I went into, okay, well, who you can also start to say, all right, who are some of these other individuals?
Well, before we get into that, just a final word, I guess, about Chom is he, DigiCash was his company. Let me see, that started.
Went bankrupt.
Started, of course, this was in Amsterdam, and it lasted until 1998 when it went bankrupt, right. Of course, because it just didn't have widespread appeal.
Well, and it was just before its time. I mean, it's an example where technology, there's a few people that I know, actually, that have developed technology.
Right.
One working with RFID validation processes one time. And this is a while back. I mean, when I was like a little kid, their company's technology was incredible for the time.
Sure.
However, it was before its time, and so this is where the idea of timing comes in. The idea that the market is in a position where it can accept what is actually being done. This is a problem with a lot of technology.
Yeah, the other benefits we mentioned, peer-to-peer. So it allowed peer-to-peer, and it also allowed untraceable transactions. So it loved it, I'm sure, actually. But that maybe.
I mean, that's Silk Road, essentially.
Silk Road, yeah.
Silk Road that developed out of this, where they were essentially trading.
Yeah.
I mean, they were trading actually. Hitmen even were able to use. Silk Road in order to, and drugs and all those other things, and so and it was a libertarian kind of utopia, right. Where there's no government, it's completely anonymous, and that everybody can live this free life, and so so if anything, that there are examples that type of trade can take place, but it can that's one of those examples where technology in and of itself is not good or bad, but it's how you use it. When you look at it from that perspective, but do you maybe jump to Neil Stephenson real quickly and just
yes, what is Cryptonomicon?
Basically, and the only reason I mention this is, and I've only listened to part of it, and it's as you said, it's 900 pages, and I used to listen to these early pioneers, and when it came to online transactions, and digitizing cash to begin with. And this book seemed to be like one of those ideas that generated a lot of their thinking at that time. And it's interesting. So the book is, it has a couple of threads.
Oh no, what happened?
Recording in progress.
And he's working alongside Alan Turing. And it's just like the idea of the Enigma machine, is that they can read the enemy's mail, so to speak.
So the description that I have in my notes of the book, I didn't read it. 900
Right.
pages, I didn't read it. But it's a massive, hyper-dense techno thriller that brilliantly weaves together the birth of World War II code breaking
Right.
at Bletchley Park with a 1990s dot-com era conspiracy to build an offshore digital data haven and a gold-backed cryptocurrency. So there you go. If you think you would like that kind of book, set yourself up for about a year's worth of reading, maybe. So.
Yeah, no, but that sounds like that sounds a little complex. But I mean, if anybody had seen the Imitation Game, and saw where they actually ended up breaking the Germans' codes, that's essentially the whole idea. Is that then they ask the same question that, and this is prior to the Imitation Game. The question of, all right, well, now you have the codes of your enemy. How do you basically, it is unethical, but sink their ship without them being able to detect that the fact that you've broken their mail. So it has to be very strategically spent. And this is even the idea of how knowledge and energy itself is actually starting to be used. So basically, now the mathematician that had broken it along with Alan Turing in the book has a grandson who's the programmer, and he's out in the islands. And that essentially, from there, he has this place where he can store information that no government can reach. And from that place, that a digital currency and backed by gold that no state can trace or monitor emerges. And that's the story of the book. But you can see now clearly how he's taking storytelling, and this would then expand people's imagination so that they could actually then come up with how would digital money work? How could it work?
Yeah,
how could it work outside the system?
Right.
And the book, The PayPal Wars, really captures a lot of these ideas really well, really, really well, about those early days where, essentially big banks were working to keep them out of the equation.
One of the interesting parts of the book, or at least parts of the notes that I read about the book, was Bletchley Park. And this, people don't know that before there were computers, before Alan Turing, we came up with, an early computer, there was a group of women who worked in Bletchley Park that did the code breaking. They were all good at mathematics. And so they were the ones that actually did the German code breaking. And there was a really interesting BBC series about those women. They never fully got credit, I think, for what they did. Typical, don't give women credit. Same as it's going on again, I think, with our military. You get rid of the women that are upper echelon in the military. Women are just not up to it, they say. That's ridiculous. But Bletchley Park, I do remember enjoying that series and watching it. So you might want to look that up. It's probably on YouTube now, hopefully.
Yeah, and
so we talked about the early part of the book anyway. So let's see. Mike has something. Maybe he remembers Bletchley Park.
or Grace Hopper.
I thought I would mention
Mike Taylor.
Peter Hilton, who was a well-known mathematician, worked in categories and functors and algebraic topology.
Yeah.
He used to come down to University of Central Florida once a year in the winter and teach a special course. He was retired at that point. But as a teenager, perhaps a bit beyond a teenager, he worked at Bletchley Park and worked fairly closely with Alan Turing.
Wow.
And he would tell us these wonderful stories about what was going on up there and about touring. So that was quite interesting. And he would mention, as he told the stories, that this was information that was supposed to be classified, but no one was looking anymore.
Yeah.
Okay. So that was quite interesting.
Very.
Yeah, for that aspect of the book, it might be worth reading. It's just a very long read. I understand a few more things. It says why should you read the book? It's written years before mainstream advent of Bitcoin. Stevenson accurately foresaw the ideological and cryptographic underpinnings of digital currencies. The historical mathematical sections are incredibly well researched, breathing life into the origins of modern computing, cryptography, and information security. So, there you go. Maybe.
Yeah, he has another book called Snow Crash that I haven't read. But it's interesting, and it's using computer code, and it gets into the idea of linguistics as well. But in the first line, I think it was in the beginning was the command, as opposed in the beginning was the word. Right. And so that that's how the book opens. So you can look into the philosophical there. It's the idea of the Gospel of John and cryptology coming together.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned his other book, Snow Crash, which they suggest is a bit shorter. And they say if you want to get into him, read Snow Crash first before you get into.
That is and again I only the reason I know about Neil Stevenson, but I also the reason these two books had come to my attention was that that these are a lot of the early pioneers, specifically Cryptonomicon had actually been kind of a thing that created the thought genesis of even just digital cash, and there were a couple of PayPal founders that had mentioned it in passing, so that it was one of their more influential books. So and again, I think that this all kind of gets there's an underlying idea here that taking what we do in the physical world, and you're seeing how that this could be a way of making it accessible to the world and also making it efficient, as a way, as opposed to there being a limited number of people having access to something fundamental.
By the way, if you have a question, raise your hand and feel free to jump in and ask. Some of the stuff we're talking about is confusing, so we'll take questions anytime.